The millet fields were gray, choked by a drought that refused to break. In the nameless village, the wind carried only dust and the scent of dry earth. Your father spent his days scraping the hard ground, his hands cracked and bleeding, while your mother searched the edges of the village graves for edible herbs. Famine was not a distant threat. It was a constant, breathing presence in the corner of your home. You were 4, small enough to hide in the shadows. Winter arrived with a biting, relentless frost that turned the mud to stone. One night, the silence in the room changed. It became heavy, absolute. You woke to the sound of your mother's ragged, stifled breathing. She was holding your baby sister, rocking back and forth. But the child did not stir. There was no fever, no struggle, only the stillness of a life extinguished by the cold. Your father stood by the door, his silhouette rigid against the moonlight. He did not cry. He did not reach out. He simply stared at the small, motionless bundle in your mother's arms. In that moment, the last warmth left your home. The hunger remained, but the hope had frozen solid, leaving behind a hollow space that would soon be filled by a far more calculated cruelty. The morning light brought no warmth, only the harsh reality of an empty cradle. You were too young to understand the whispers that filled the night, but you felt the change in the air. Your father sat at the wooden table, his face a mask of stone, staring at the empty space where your sister had been. Your mother moved like a ghost, her gaze fixed firmly on the dirt floor, as if she were trying to disappear into the earth itself. Then, the door creaked open. A stranger stepped inside, his presence filling the room with the smell of stale tobacco and damp wool. He did not look at your parents. He looked at you. He pulled a heavy pouch from his waist and spilled silver coins onto the table. They clattered with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed against the mud walls. Your father reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the silver, his eyes calculating the weight of your life against the cost of his own survival. He looked at you then, his expression devoid of warmth, and whispered that this was for the best. The stranger grabbed your arm, his grip hard and unyielding. You screamed, a raw, piercing sound that tore through the quiet village. But your mother did not look up. She remained motionless, her hands clenched wide at her sides, while the man dragged you out into the blinding, indifferent sun. You looked back once, but the door was already closing, sealing the silence of your home forever. The wooden cart jolted, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the dry, rutted earth. You were thrown into the back, landing hard against splintered wood. The air smelled of stale sweat and unwashed bodies. You were not alone. Beside you lay a boy, his eyes fixed on the gray sky, his mouth slightly open but silent. Across from him, a girl curled into a ball, her knees tucked against her chest, shivering despite the heat of the afternoon sun. You tried to speak, to ask where you were going, but the sound died in your throat. The man who had taken you sat at the front, his back a wall of indifference. The road stretched out for miles, a ribbon of dust winding through a landscape that looked nothing like your home. Every few hours, the cart stopped. The man would climb down, check the ropes, and toss a handful of dry millet into the cart. It was not food. It was fuel to keep the cargo alive. You watched the other children reach for the grains, their movements mechanical, devoid of any spark of life. Some had been taken from their beds, others from the fields. As the sun began to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the path, you realized the truth. You were no longer a person. You were a weight in a cart. The cart shuddered to a halt. The iron wheels ground against stone, and the heavy wooden gate groaned open to reveal a courtyard bathed in the sickly, rhythmic glow of red lantern. You were hauled out by your collar, your feet hitting the cold, damp ground for the first time in days. The air here was thick, smelling of heavy incense and damp earth, a suffocating contrast to the open fields of your past. You were pushed into a long, narrow hall where the windows were reinforced with iron bars, their shadows casting jagged patterns across the floor. A woman moved toward you, her steps silent, her eyes sweeping over your frame with the cold, detached precision of a merchant weighing grain. She signaled, and you were stripped, scrubbed in a basin of icy water, and forced to stand still while your hair was pulled and brushed until your scalp burned. You shivered, not from the cold, but from the way she touched your skin, checking for blemishes or imperfections as if you were livestock at a market. A boy nearby, his face pale and his breathing ragged, coughed into his hand. The woman did not look at him. She simply gestured to the guards, who dragged him out into the dark. She turned back to you, her expression unreadable, and leaned close. She whispered a name, soft and delicate, that did not belong to you. From this moment on, you were little Lotus. The training room was a windowless cell, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected only the parts of you they meant to change. You were 6, then 7, and birthdays had vanished into the rhythm of the house. The madam entered, her presence a heavy weight, followed by the trainer, whose hands were calloused and cold. They began with your hips. The trainer pressed into your joints with a force that made your breath hitch, pushing, kneading, and forcing your frame into a curve that felt unnatural and wrong. You tried to pull away, to shrink into the corner, but a sharp slap against your shoulder forced you back into position. They did not speak. They worked with the clinical focus of a sculptor carving stone. Then came the hair. The trainer took a thread, soaked it in thick, pungent oil, and pulled it taut against your skin. The sensation was a searing, white-hot line as the hair was ripped from the root. You bit your lip until you tasted copper, refusing to scream, because they had taught you that sound was a flaw. Your skin burned for days, raw and exposed, but they only applied more cooling salve and continued the work. The physical reshaping was only the beginning. Once your frame was sufficiently pliable, the trainer introduced the rods. They were smooth, polished instruments of varying density hardwood, cool ivory, and finally, heavy, carved stone. Each week, the objects grew in size, each one more intrusive than the last. You were forced to lie still on the silk mats, your breath hitching as the trainer inserted the rod, the pressure blooming into a searing, white-hot agony that radiated through your core. You wanted to thrash, to scream, to push the hands away, but the trainer stood over you with a switch. A single flinch earned a sharp, stinging strike. You learned to breathe through the pain, to shallow your inhales until your lungs burned, and to keep your eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then came the most insidious lesson of all, the art of the performance. You were taught to mimic the sounds of pleasure, to soften your gaze, and to curve your lips into a vacant, practiced smile, even as your spirit withered under the assault. It was a grotesque theater. By the age of 8, the training room was replaced by a small stage hidden behind heavy silk curtains. The air in the room was thick with incense, masking the scent of fear. You were led to the center, the floorboards cold beneath your feet, while the trainer retreated into the shadows. On the other side of the silk, you could hear the low murmur of voices and the clink of wine cups. These were the men who came to choose. You stood in the dim light, your body a canvas of practiced movements, waiting for the signal to begin. You moved with the slow, deliberate grace they had drilled into you, head tilted at the precise angle, eyes downcast. But the silence from the other side was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made your heart hammer against your ribs. A man spoke, his voice a gravelly demand, and your concentration wavered. For a split second, your smile faltered, the corners of your mouth dropping in a flash of genuine exhaustion. The trainer, watching from the wings, did not hesitate. A bamboo switch whistled through the air, striking your thighs with a sharp, stinging crack. You simply adjusted your posture, resumed the slow, rhythmic sway, and continued. The training evolved from the physical to the chemical. Every morning, the trainer brought a small, dark, ceramic bowl. The liquid inside was bitter, thick with herbs that coated your tongue and left a lingering, metallic tang. You drank it, without question. Within weeks, the effects took hold. Your muscles, once taut from the constant movement, began to grow soft and lethargic. Your voice, which had once been clear, turned thin and reedy, losing its natural resonance until it sounded like a stranger's whisper. You tried to recall the sound of your mother's voice in the village, but the memory was a smudge of gray, dissolving under the influence of the concoctions. The madam demanded more. She ordered your face to be scrubbed raw, then layered with thick white powder that clogged your pores. They painted your lips a deep bruised crimson and doused you in heavy, cloying perfume that clung to your hair and skin. You looked in the polished bronze mirror and saw only a doll, a carefully curated illusion. You were no longer a person. You were a product. The day arrived with a cold, gray light filtering through the paper screens. You were 9. The trainer did not offer the usual morning tea. Instead, she gripped your arm, her fingers digging into your skin, and pulled you toward the back of the house. You walked past the familiar training rooms, past the other boys who sat in silent, vacant rows, and toward the heavy, lacquered door at the end of the corridor. Every step felt like walking into a void. You tried to slow your pace, to plant your heels against the polished floor, but a sharp shove from behind sent you stumbling forward. The trainer stopped at the threshold, her expression devoid of any warmth. She pushed the door open, revealing a room that smelled of stale wine and heavy, cloying sandalwood. Inside, a man sat on a low stool, his back to the light. He was old, his frame hunched, his presence heavy and suffocating. As you entered, he turned. His face was a map of deep, etched lines, and his mouth pulled into a wide, predatory grin that did not reach his eyes. The trainer nodded once, a silent, final command, and stepped back. The door clicked shut behind you, the sound echoing like a heavy lock falling into place. The man stood, his movements slow and deliberate, the scent of wine clinging to his breath. He called you, Little Lotus, his voice a soft, chilling caress that made your skin crawl. He reached out, his fingers cold and clinical as he traced the line of your jaw, inspecting you like a piece of fruit on a market stall. You held your breath, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the end. Then, without a word of warning, his hand snapped forward. The slap was sharp, a stinging, rhythmic strike that echoed in the small, quiet room. It was not born of anger, but of a grotesque, practiced ritual. You reeled back, the taste of copper blooming in your mouth. The world tilted, the dim light blurring into a haze of gray. When it was finally over, the man left a single coin on the table, a hollow payment for the life you had just lost. You remained on the bed, limbs trembling, the trauma settling into your bones like ice. Hours bled into one another in the dark. The door groaned open, and the madam stepped into the room. She did not look at the bed, but at the coin left on the table. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and then looked at you. Her face was a mask of calculated satisfaction, the corners of her mouth pulling up into a thin, sharp line. "Congratulations," she purred, the sound vibrating in the stagnant air. "You are a professional now. Ha 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 ha." She reached into a small pouch and pulled out a bun, still warm, and pressed it into your hand. It was a hollow gesture of celebration, a reward for the work completed. You looked at the bread, then at her. She waited, her eyes fixed on you, demanding a reaction. You took a small bite, the taste of sugar and yeast thick on your tongue. You tried to swallow, to force the food down, but your throat tightened. A wave of nausea surged from your stomach, sharp and uncontrollable. You doubled over, the bun slipping from your fingers onto the floor. You retched, your body convulsing as it rejected the offering, the bitter taste of your new reality rising to your lips. The madam watched, her expression unchanging, as you emptied yourself onto the floor. She did not offer comfort. She simply turned and walked out, leaving you alone in the silence. The work resumed the next morning, a relentless cycle of silence and service. You became a curiosity among the patrons. They did not pay for your smile, for that had been extinguished in the dark, private rooms. They paid for your stillness. They sat in the dim light, watching you move with a cold, mechanical precision. You painted your lips, brushed your hair, and draped yourself in silk, all while your mind remained elsewhere, drifting in a void. One evening, a man lingered after the others had left. He did not touch you. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, polished object. He pressed it into your hand. "Look," he whispered, his voice a strange, fleeting echo of kindness. You raised the mirror, your fingers trembling. Instead, you saw a stranger. The eyes were hollow, the face a mask of practiced, empty grace. You tilted the glass, searching for a trace of your former self, but there was nothing left. The person staring back was a ghost, a hollow vessel. You set the mirror down, the realization settling into your chest like lead. At 13, you became the most profitable boy in the house, a testament to a transformation that had stripped away every remnant of your origin. The madam summoned you to her private quarters, her movements deliberate and slow. She sat behind a desk, her hands folded over a ledger. She spoke of a final promotion, a procedure to ensure you would never age, never change, and never be replaced. She called it a gift of permanence, a way to secure your value for the rest of your life. You listened, your gaze fixed on the wall behind her. You had seen the others, the ones who had undergone the knife. You remembered their voices, thin and ethereal, and the way their eyes blinked too slowly, as if the world were moving at a pace they could no longer track. They were shadows, hollowed out and kept in the corners of the house. As the madam laid out the details, the chilling truth settled into your bones. The surgeon's knife was merely a formality. It would alter the flesh, but the person you once were had already ceased to exist years ago. You felt nothing as she spoke. No fear, no resistance. 4 years drifted by, a blur of repetitive motions and hollow air. You turned 17, and the house began to change around you. New boys arrived, younger and softer, their movements still clumsy with the remnants of their own pasts. The madam no longer looked at you with the same calculated satisfaction. Instead, her eyes slid past you, searching for the next commodity. The atmosphere shifted. Your perfume, once provided in abundance, was now measured out in stingy, precise drops. The silk you wore felt thinner, worn at the edges from years of service. You watched from the shadows as the trainer worked with a new arrival, teaching him the same slow, graceful walk you had mastered a decade ago. The realization was quiet, but absolute. You were no longer the favorite. Clients stopped asking for you, their interest diverted by the fresh, untainted faces. Your price dropped, and with it, your relevance in the house. You sat in the corner, a relic of a previous cycle, listening to the laughter of the patrons. You were 17, and in this place, that made you a ghost. The summons came at midnight, a sharp knock on the door that broke the silence of your room. You walked to the office, your steps heavy, the floorboards creaking under your weight. The madam sat behind her desk, her face a mask of calculated indifference. She did not look up as you entered. She simply pushed a single coin across the polished wood, the metal clinking with a finality that echoed in the small space. She told you that your time had passed, that there was no longer a place for you here. She handed you a single, rough robe and gestured toward the back door. She warned you never to return, her voice devoid of any emotion. You stepped out into the alleyway, the door slamming shut behind you with a sound that severed your only connection to the world. The city stretched out before you, vast and unfamiliar, a labyrinth of dark streets and locked gates. You were finally free. The alleyway was a canyon of damp stone and discarded refuse. You stood there until the cold seeped through the thin robe, numbing your skin. You took a step, then another, moving toward the main thoroughfare. Beijing was a sprawling, chaotic beast of noise and motion. You had never cooked a meal, never bartered for goods, never navigated a street without a handler. The world was a blur of faces, all moving with purpose, all ignoring the figure that drifted between them. You tried to recall a single skill from your life before the red lanterns, but your mind was a hollow shell. You were a creature of silk and perfume, now exposed to the biting wind of reality. You wandered for hours, your feet aching, your stomach twisting. You reached the city gates, where the crowds thickened. You sat on the hard ground, your back against the cold brick, watching the people pass by. You held out a hand, not out of hope, but out of a desperate primal need to exist. You were a forgotten fragment, waiting for the end. The city gate was a bottleneck of humanity. You remained in the shadows, your hand outstretched, a silent plea to the passing crowd. The air grew heavy with the smell of coal, smoke, and wet earth. A group of men approached, their voices loud and confident. You recognized the gait, the specific rhythm of their footsteps. One man stopped, his shadow falling over you like a shroud. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the grime on your face. He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the noise. He did not offer a hand or a word of recognition. Instead, he reached into his sleeve, pulled out a copper coin, and flicked it with his thumb. It landed with a soft thud in the thick, black mud at your feet. He watched you, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, waiting to see if you would move. You looked at the coin, then at his polished boots. You did not hesitate. You dropped to your knees, your hands clawing into the freezing sludge. He spat on the ground and walked away. You remained on your knees, the coin clutched tight, the mud staining your skin, aware you were now filth. The coin felt like a piece of ice against your palm. You stayed in the mud until the street grew quiet and the lanterns flickered out. The wind shifted, turning sharp and biting, carrying the first heavy flakes of winter. You forced yourself to stand, your joints stiff and unresponsive. You dragged your feet toward the back of a nearby bathhouse, seeking the warmth of the exhaust vents. The steam rose in thick, white plumes, mocking the frost forming on your eyelashes. You huddled against the brick wall, pulling your knees to your chest, trying to trap the last of your body heat. The shivering stopped, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness that seeped into your marrow. Your vision blurred, the world narrowing to the rhythm of the falling snow. You closed your eyes, and the sounds of the city faded into a dull, rhythmic thrum. By dawn, the snow had piled high against your frame, obscuring the shape of you. A worker, clearing the path behind the bathhouse, struck your shoulder with a shovel. He stopped, leaned down, and brushed the white powder from your face. He did not recognize you. He signaled to the others, and they dragged you away. The earth outside the city wall was hard and unforgiving. A shallow trench was dug, and you were lowered into it alongside a thief and a drunk. No markers were placed. No words were spoken. The soil was shoveled over you until the ground was flat and indistinguishable from the rest of the wasteland. Back at the house, the madam stood in the center of the main room. She held a brush in her hand, her expression entirely unchanged by the news of your death. She walked toward a small, trembling boy who had arrived that morning. She tilted his chin up, inspected his features, and nodded with a thin, satisfied smile. "From now on," she whispered, "you are little Lotus." The boy did not know the name belonged to a ghost. He simply bowed his head, accepting the label as his own. The red lanterns continued to glow, casting the same light on new faces. Your life was gone, your memory extinguished, and the world moved on without a single ripple.